Thank you so much. It's lovely to be here. Okay, just trying to get my timer here. Okay, so today I'll cover a bunch of ground, and I'll start by who I am and why I hope I have something useful to share with you in this community. I'll talk about digital inequality and the importance of internet skills. I'll talk about why you should care about these things, even if you think you don't care about them. Then I'll explain how I came to studying older adults, in particular, what methods I use. I'll bust some myths about older adults and internet use. I'll talk a little bit about ChatGPT know-how, and then social media uses by different population segments, and then I'll do a summary. So who am I, other than the fact that I like turtles, which is not really relevant to today? Maybe you know this XKCD graphic. I think it's very telling, it's very helpful, and I think it does place sociologists in the right position on this spectrum. And as you heard, I am a sociologist. All my degrees are in sociology. And is that not too dark for the folks here? You're not gonna fall asleep? Okay. Okay, yeah, thanks. So sociology, as far as I'm concerned, is correct on that end of the spectrum because we see the world as really complicated and very hard to squeeze into pretty models because we study humans and groups of humans and organizations, and they are just really complicated. So, and I think the reason I can be helpful here is that, so there are different methods people use, and I've looked at the program, and I know enough about web science to know that a lot of the methods used here have to do with big data and quantitative, and some of what I'll talk about is also quantitative, but it's survey-based, and I don't think too many of you work on surveys that much per se. And as you'll see, I have several slides, and I will talk in some detail about methods, partly because I'm just a methods geek, but also because I think partly what I can bring to this group is sharing how other methods can be helpful for the work that you do. And this isn't to say that any one method is better than another, but that we can benefit from a plurality of methods. And on that point, I will just point out this paper that I co-authored with several computational social scientists, where it appeared in Nature a couple of years ago, where we talk about the benefits, the opportunities, but also the challenges of computational social science. And for me, it was really interesting to work with this group because I was probably the key survey person in the group, and it was really interesting to have conversations that, undoubtedly, I'm a completely biased person to say this, but I think it's a really helpful piece, so I hope you check it out. Okay, so digital inequality is it's actually a phrase that my graduate school advisor and I coined over 20 years ago, and the overarching question that guides all of my work and has guided all of my work for a long time is about whether people can benefit from their internet uses, or do they get left behind? Who gets left behind? Do some get left behind? So you've probably heard of the term digital divide, and it's often used to signal inequalities in digital media uses. Originally, it basically referred to the haves and the have-nots, and the idea is that once you become an internet user, a digital media user, you've crossed to the correct side of the divide and all is great. But what we already suggested over 2 decades ago was that, in fact, there's a spectrum, and it's much more complicated than that, and just because people join and start using digital media doesn't mean that they have effective, efficient uses, or that they're savvy, or that they know what they're doing, or that they can benefit equally. And so graphically, the framework that I work with, the theoretical framework that I work with is mostly I start out with a user. So even though non-users still exist in the world, they're not the ones I study and I focus on. So I focus on users, recognizing very explicitly that they're in a certain socioeconomic position in society. And then also recognizing that they have different technical and social context in which they use technologies. And I and others, many others at this point, have shown that these factors then all influence people's levels of skills. And I'll talk in a little bit about what I mean by that and how we can operationalize it. And then all of this may well influence what people do with digital technologies, whether that concerns information consumption or content production. And then, especially as a sociologist, the million-dollar question is, as to who cares, is does this then feed back into people's life chances, right? So sociological research and research from other fields certainly tells us that all sorts of social advantages get perpetuated and reproduced over generations. But the question here is, well, does internet use play a role in any of that puzzle? As you heard about my book, Connected in Isolation, I actually was able to show that, in fact, it does. So what I did there, beyond the fact proving to myself that my coping mechanism during COVID was to work like crazy, was I collected data, right, like the first month of the pandemic in 3 countries, and then looked at whether skills and autonomy of use, robust internet access, while controlling for all sorts of socioeconomic factors, does it relate to knowledge about COVID and staying safe? And it did. So it turns out internet use matters. You heard it here first, probably not. Okay, so what are the possible theoretical outcomes or theoretical approaches to the possible outcomes that may come from differentiated internet use? So there's the idea of social mobility, which would be that people who start out with less resources, thanks to the digital media uses, might actually catch up with people who have more, who are in more advantageous positions in society. Alternatively, we have social reproduction, which is that everyone is benefiting, but people who are more privileged are benefiting at higher rates, so ultimately they come out ahead. You'll note that in both of these graphs, there's a bias towards a positive view, which is that everyone's benefiting, but actually that need not be the case. It could also be that some people benefit and some people don't benefit, and if it's the people who are less privileged who are more likely to lose out, then the inequality might become even larger, although that might also be the case there. And in case you're wondering, what does this look like? So for example, you're not skilled, you don't realize how your online actions might reflect when you're seeking a job. You might actually lose your job or not get the job you'd like because of your online actions. Like that's where this might actually go down, just as an example. There are others too, financial losses, identity theft, such examples. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about internet skills since it's very core to what I do and what I'll talk about today. So over the years, I mean, this is something that at this point, I guess I've been working on for 25 years, so quite some time. And so over the years, my thinking about it has evolved. Originally in the late 90s, it was much more specific to certain things, and certainly I wasn't thinking about algorithm skills and things of that sort. But I have always thought about awareness of what is possible as a very core level of skill, right? So you can care about your privacy, but if you don't know that it's possible to change your privacy settings, then you can't benefit from the fact that you can change them. Or you can be overwhelmed and annoyed by all the notifications you're getting from different services. If you don't know that you can actually change your notification settings, then again, you can't get out of that annoyance loop. And then there are these different dimensions of skill that we talk about in this paper that I'll just let you look at the list because I could easily spend the hour talking about these. So why is it helpful to look at skills? So we know from digital inequality research that different socioeconomic status factors do relate to how people use the internet, but obviously we can't quickly change people's financial status or their education. However, internet skills is the kind of thing where we could potentially in a quicker way intervene and actually make a difference. So if internet skills on their own matter, then that's a really good place for intervention. So that's one of the reasons it's worth looking at. So how can we measure internet skills? So I'm all about measurement. And so two important ways for measuring internet skills over the years have been observations, interviews, and surveys. And so what I did many years ago, which a few others have done, but really not as many as I wish would have done over the years, is do an observational study, have measures of what I call actual skills, at the same time collect survey measures, and then see which survey measures correlate best with the actual skill measures. So that's the approach I used, and it is a crazy amount of work, and that's probably why there isn't much more of it. But so that's where the skill question comes from, and I know you're going to have comments about it, so I'll talk a little bit more about it. But this is what I call the general internet skills measure, and it's going to seem super simplistic to you, I'm sure, because I've gotten all sorts of comments over the years. I have two separate papers that talk about just the measure, and there have been all sorts of other skill measures proposed in the literature, and some are better than others. One of the biggest challenges of most of the skill measures in the literature, in terms of survey measures, is that they take a ton of survey space. And for any of you who have done surveys, you know that there's never enough survey space, right? That there are always more questions you want to ask than there's space for. So unless your study is all about internet skills, which most studies aren't, you can't afford to spend half of your survey questions on just one measure of skill. And so that's why it was very, very important to come up with a fairly limited length, cognitively not too tasking question that could then be deployed on numerous instruments in different populations. And so I was happy when a few years ago, it was actually replicated on this measure was replicated on the European Social Survey in over a dozen languages. So now we have that data. And then there's a social media skills measure that I will refer to, which is similar but with different terms. Okay, but how good are surveys, right? There's always the question. And every method has its limitations, and I'll be the first to admit surveys definitely do. One thing you can do if you ever do surveys is to include an attention check question. Pretty much all surveys, I believe, should include this as just the very core minimum way to screen out bad cases. There's a whole literature just on attention span questions attention check questions. And they have their own biases and they can be much more complex, and then that complicates things. So it is something you can read up on. But I'm just putting it out there that if you do ever run a survey, please very seriously consider an attention check verification. Okay. So one of the questions I get is, well, when people fill out these forms of the rate your level of understanding of the different terms, I mean, aren't they just kind of putting things in? And so years ago, I did a study in response to some of this feedback when I had more skill items, where I actually included some bogus items. And you'll see that within the list of skill items that they were with, they did rank the lowest. Now, they didn't. In reality, they should be 1 because these don't actually exist, so how could anyone actually understand them? And it shows that it is a fuzzy measure, but they did rate the lowest. So it's not that people are just completely randomly saying what they think, what they're familiar with. Okay, so this is the slide where I explain why you should care about all this, even if you don't actually care about digital inequality and you don't really care about skills. So there are lots of questions that people care about, and here are just 3. And these are the kinds of questions that people in this community might care about. And I'll explain why inequality and skills matter to these research questions. So for example, you could be studying whether social media use relates to political participation, or you could be studying whether older adults' use of digital media contributes to or eases loneliness, which is an extremely important health measure. Or you could be looking at whether gaming or other online technologies have health consequences. And whatever are these questions, you might be interested, or name your own favorite question. What I argue is that it can benefit from a digital inequality perspective because your answer to what the link may be will very likely be dependent on people's socioeconomic background and their skills. So it's important to collect data on diverse populations, and it's important to have some sense of who the people are to see whether, let's say you find that social media use does connect to political participation. My answer would be, okay, but does it actually depend on people's skills? Is the answer different depending on their skills, or is it different depending on their education, et cetera? Okay, so let's talk about older adults. And I'm going to focus on age, but with the ultimate message that age is actually not necessarily what's important. So that may sound confusing. Hopefully that'll be clearer once I get to later in the talk. So how did I come to studying older adults? So early on, I actually studied people of all ages, and then I did work on younger adults, and generally found skill differences across the population. And in the media, there's a very overarching general approach, and also in public rhetoric, that older adults are clueless with technologies, they don't know what they're doing, they have no idea what's going on. And I wasn't convinced, based on the data collection that I'd been doing for years on people of all ages. And so I decided to start focusing on this population. And several years ago, not too many, but a few now, years ago, my former colleague, Amanda Hunsaker, and I did a review of the literature at that time about older adults and internet use, and found that at that time, and this has changed a lot since then, but at that time, almost all literature about older adults and internet use was simply about if you're an older adult who uses the internet is something different, right? It wasn't what you do online, how you do it, how much of it you do. It was just, are you an internet user? Now that's clearly an incredibly basic level of measure. So it seemed like there was room for more. And so that's when I decided that I was interested in getting into this area more. And so the methods that I use to study older adults' internet uses are interviews and surveys. And so just a few words about the interview studies, which I'm not going to talk about much today, but I just want you to see what some of the background work that went into this. And for those of you who aren't familiar with these types of methods, so often when you want to do a survey, you need to know enough about an area to put together a survey. And if you don't, it can be helpful to start with qualitative methods to get some understanding of the domain before you then construct a survey. And so that's what we did. We decided to start with interviews, and it was a really big qualitative study. We did almost 120 interviews with people in 7 countries, adults ages 60 plus, which is the World Health Organization's definition of older adults. And so we interviewed lots of people. I did a bunch of these. I did the ones in the US and Hungary, and then team members did the ones elsewhere. And we ended up publishing quite a few papers from this material, where we realized, among other things, that older adults are often not clueless about technologies. They're often excited about technologies. They are also often a good source of support for others, which is definitely not anything you'd hear from public rhetoric about older adults, right? But partly recognizing, even as you just think about it, someone who's 60 today would have been in the labor force at this point for 2 decades when the internet was already around, right? So there's no reason someone who's 65 couldn't be savvy, in fact. But there are plenty of people in their 70s who are also quite savvy. In fact, some of the people who created some of these technologies are in that age now. So then I thought, okay, I want to do more work on this. And I approached John Palfrey, who's a legal scholar, used to be at Harvard Law School, and now is the president of the MacArthur Foundation in the US, and has published 2 books. No, he's published many books, but 2 relevant here. One was Born Digital from 2008, and then a few years ago, The Connected Parent, both published with Urs Gasser. And I thought, okay, well, John has written about kids and he's written about parents. I wonder if he'd be interested in writing about older adults. And I thought this kind of a book, which I wanted to be a trade publication and do more of a summary of what we know, would be nice to do with someone with somewhat of a different background. And so we decided to collaborate, and we have this is not the final cover, obviously. So we did complete the manuscript about 2 months ago, and now it's in production, and the marketing people are figuring out what the cover should look like, but it's coming out with the University of Chicago Press in a year, and so it's been really great to work on this book. But in addition to the interviews, we wanted to have survey data that we could analyze for the book, because with survey data, it's much more feasible to do random sampling and have a nationally representative sample from which we could then generalize findings. And so now I want to tell you about 2 surveys that I conducted that form the basis of the findings that I share with you today. So one, and I partly say a few words about these surveys because, again, I'm pretty sure not all of you have experiences with surveys, and I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about surveys. And I know with students at least, one of the points I usually hear is that, surveys are easy, and they're cheap. And so I just want to bust some of those myths as well while I'm at it. Okay, so one survey was adults of all ages. Both are based in the US. The other survey is of adults 60 plus. And this ended up being a 2 times 2,000 older adults. So the original idea was to do 2,000 older adults, but the survey became really long. And one of the things you shouldn't do with surveys is make them super long, because people get really tired and they either give you bad responses or just leave altogether. So ended up branching out into 2. I want to highlight that these are cross-sectional, not panel, which means it's just one point in time. So we can't make causal arguments from the data. It's mostly to describe the situation. So the tab for the first one was $51,000, and the tab for the second was $60,000. So again, not cheap, just putting that out there. So to have a really high quality survey, it does cost resources, and that's just the money we paid to the provider. That's not the staffing or anything. Okay, so the first survey we did just a little under a year ago, and quota sampled an age, gender, education region of the US. And I share the social media usage just because it'll be relevant later. And then the second, and then here's sample descriptives. And I should note that all of the results I share today are based on the weighted sample. You can see that the 2 are actually quite similar, and that shows that it's a really good sampling from the start. But there is a little bit of correction. And then the second survey, which I'll denote with OA for older adults on the different slides, is, as I mentioned, people 60 plus in the US. This conducted in October, and similar details. And here again, social media use is 90%, just like it was for the among 60 plus from the other survey. Now, I should recognize, so this was an online only survey, so it has no data about non-users. As I mentioned in the beginning, my research is focused on users. So in that sense, it's not a problem, but we should recognize that it's already, by only having data on people who are internet users, we're already screening on some of the least privileged people in the population. So again, very diverse sample, and already the original sample is quite representative, but there's some adjustment with the weights. So let's bust a couple of age-related myths. One is that, as I mentioned, is that older adults are clueless about technology, and then the other is this assumption that young adults are savvier than older adults. And I'd like to think that when people say that, they're thinking people in their 80s, but if you teach and you talk to students who are in their 20s, you know that if you're 30, you're already an older person. Which when I started teaching was a shock to me. I started teaching when I was 29. It was pretty depressing. But anyway, and you can imagine how depressing it is now. So I just wanted to say that. And that is, anyway, so that's where this is coming from. So let me graph for you the relationship of skills and age. And I'm assuming in this audience, everyone can picture what this would look like if it was the stereotype, right? It would be like this. But this is what the actual data look like, and this is the skill measure I shared, so it's just an index measure, one measure. And so if we want to plot that, I mean, there is, if you squint, you can sort of see that there is, in fact, a little bit of a negative relationship. But if we take people, if we just restrict the sample to people 70 and under, there is no relationship. There's no statistically significant correlation. And I'm sure that when people think older adults, they don't just mean 71 and up. Okay, how about social media skills? Again, there's a little bit of relationship there, and here it's more common that younger adults are in fact more savvy. But here too, if we restrict to 70 under, there is no statistically significant correlation. Okay, so I'm gonna say I've busted these. And I have data sets over the years, different populations, that are very consistent with these findings. Not entirely, for a while it was more the 60 plus, and again, as people get older and they're already knowledgeable about the internet and they become part of that older adult group, that older adult group does get savvier, partly for that reason. So I wanted to say a little bit about ChatGPT skills in particular, since that's something very new, and we had the opportunity to look at this since we were running these surveys last year. So here is the question. This was a multiple choice question, right? So here we're really going for knowledge, like, do you know it? And so I'm gonna give you a minute to read through these options, and I'm gonna guess you'll have a pretty good sense of which one's correct. And these are not easy to write, right? Anyone here who teaches, which I suspect is most of you, knows from writing test questions. Okay, so 63.5% in the general population survey got this right. So let's see by age who actually got this right. And what's interesting here is that under 60, there's no relationship of knowledge with age, nothing. Now, starting with 60, it does go down a little bit. What is a much more obvious finding, however, is that people who are more educated are more likely to know what ChatGPT is, and people who come from a more higher financial resources are more likely to know what ChatGPT is. Now, these are bivariate relationships. So that was the general population sample, and now I'll show you for the older adult sample. So here you do see a gradual decrease in knowledge by groups of about 5 years. But here again, very strong relationship, even just within older adults, your level of education very much matters, as does your socioeconomic resources. So we didn't ask about income. We did, but lots of missing data because many older adults don't have income anymore. So we actually have a different measure for socioeconomic status, and it has to do with certain economic resources that you may or may not have, meaning can you go on vacation, can you buy fresh veggies, fruit, that kind of thing. And so the fewer resources you have, that's less economic social status, and which is linked to less knowledge. But again, these are bivariate relationships. And now I present to you the results in narrative form of regression analyses, where logit regressions, where I control for the different factors, right? And so here what we look at is, are there age differences if you control for, or when you control for education, income, and gender, actually. And what we find is that for the general population, no difference still under 60, and it's still robust to the other findings, right? So higher, more privileged position, more knowledge about ChatGPT. And independently of all that, more robust access, so more resources to access the internet, and higher general internet skills, independent relationship with ChatGPT knowledge, right? So even when you control for education and income and age, you see that difference. Within the older adult sample, what we find is that when you do control for all these other factors, there's actually no age difference under 80. It's really the socioeconomic status that's driving even the age differences. Okay, so now the final sort of findings that I want to talk about have to do with social media use. And now, I'm not going to get into a lot of detail. It's mostly about social media adoption. Who's on the different platforms? Why should you care? So here, I think for this community in particular, you should absolutely care, because even just looking at the listing of the program for this conference, there are lots of papers that are specific to platforms, right? Where the sampling frame is basically a platform. So that's why you should care. So we have big data, but the question is bigger always better? Is it really the size that matters? And as I try to explain to my students over and over and over again, and it seems to be a really hard point to get across though, it's not the size that matters, it's the sampling, the recruitment and quality of sampling that matters. And so I'll explain why. I'm just going to share some data and then I'll come back to that point. So from the general population survey, we have here information about what proportion of under 60s and 60 plus are on various social media platforms. And you can see that Facebook and Pinterest, there's no difference by age, but for the others, younger people, or the younger group, is more likely to use them. By the way, I'll point out that Pinterest remains a really, really much used platform that almost nobody studies. But I mean, I think it's important to take note of that. Like, everyone's always surprised on these graphs, and it is really still one of a really popular platform. Okay, so now if we control for users of each respective platform and look at whether people post, share, comment, you'll see that in the majority of cases, there's actually no difference among people under 60 and 60 and over. They're just as likely to be engaged. So that's already, I think, an important data point. We also asked what kinds of people users are connected to on the different platforms. And this is what it is by age. And you can see that here there are quite a few differences if you group all the platforms together, right? So you take all 8 platforms, and you see that other than family and worship, younger age group and older adults are at different rates for the different types of connections. But when you break it out by platform, depending on the type of connection, I know this is a lot of data. I'm still figuring out how to graph it well, so it's comprehensible. But you'll see that when it comes to linking to family on different platforms, other than on WhatsApp and TikTok, there are no age differences in whether people are linking to family on the different platform. There are more for close friends, but not so much for people you only know online and for strangers. So again, this is just to show that age differences they're not huge age differences. even in terms of the types of networks that people are cultivating on different platforms. Okay, so older adults themselves are on all sorts of platforms. This is restricted to people who use at least one. And so now back to this question of big data and sampling frame and who cares. Okay, so here again, results of regression summarized. So you have pluses and minus signs for statistically significant findings at 0.01, although I think most are higher, but much stronger. And what we have here is that in almost all cases, people who are more educated are more likely to be on these platforms. And in several cases, women are more likely to be on them, but in some cases, like LinkedIn and Twitter and Reddit, men are more likely to be on them. People with lower financial resources are less likely to be on Pinterest, Instagram, WhatsApp. And so this is relevant because you have to recognize that when you use these platforms as your sampling frame, you're already biasing towards a certain type of person. Now, these data are about older adults. I've published before from prior data collections about the general population, where we also very much find similar things. And additionally, people who have higher internet skills are more likely to be on everything except for Facebook. So again, you're getting a savvier crowd by default if you're sampling on a platform. Okay, so I'm almost done. I just have my recap slide. So the things I'd like you to take away from this talk are adults of all ages vary in their internet skills. If you recall those dotted figures, I mean, there are dots everywhere. And so they're skilled and not skilled adults of all ages, across ages. And some older adults in particular are very skilled, in fact. Others less so, and this is just like with every other age group. There is a digital inequality in skills. I showed this to you specifically with respect to ChatGPT, but and work by other people at this point, different country samples, different time periods, has shown that socioeconomic status very much relates to skills, so those who are more privileged have better skills. Many older adults are active on social media, not just on Facebook, so that's important to keep in mind. And there's digital inequality in who is on platforms. So when you sample on a platform, just keep in mind that you've already selected out on a whole bunch of variables that may be relevant for the questions you're asking. And so my call for those of you who do use platforms as your sampling frame is just to be thoughtful about what biases you may be introducing as you sample on just the users of certain platforms. And I will thank my collaborators on this project and open it up for questions and comments. Thank you.